So today I'm going to talk about climate change impacts on northern forests, but really within the context of adaptation. So climate change impacts, but what we can do to some degree about climate change impacts. So Great Lakes forests are, of course, very diverse. We've got barrens, oak woodlands, we've got wetland forests, both in peat and in soil. We have conifer wetland forests, we have hardwood wetland forests, we have the iconic upland forests as well. Tremendous diversity across the Great Lakes in the forests that we have, and an equal diversity, I would argue, in the ownership of those forests. You look in the east, and you see all that red private ownership, dominant, absolutely dominant in the east. You look in the western part of this map where we are, and you'll see a lot more public ownership, but even then you have federal, you have state, you have county, which are very diverse, and even community forests. But still the largest single group is private ownership. And of course, private owners are not a monolithic block of owners. They themselves are very diverse in the reasons that they own the land, how they view it, and how they live in it and with it, and what they see. And that ranges, of course, from a lot of the classic recreational activities to outright cultural activities that have existed, of course, for many, many generations. And of course, let's not forget the economic importance of forests in our Great Lakes. They're responsible for something like 100,000 jobs across the three Great Lakes forests just in Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And those aren't all just folks working in the woods. A lot of those jobs are in industries that are in some way dependent upon forest products or the people who are in fact working in the woods. And so it's not at $30 billion, more than $30 billion, it's not a small industry. And this isn't even getting into tourism yet. So this is just those classic industries associated with forestry. In Wisconsin alone, forest-based tourism is estimated to be at something like $2.5 billion. And so you think across all the Great Lakes where people are interested in visiting the North Woods, one of the things that they expect to do is be in a forest, a beautiful forest, perhaps on a lake, surrounded by a forest, fishing, which is always wonderful. And another thing to talk about when you talk about Great Lakes forests, and the Great Lakes in particular, the lands, is that we're borderlands. And when I'm talking about borderlands, I'm not just talking about Canada. I'm, in this case, talking about biomes. And so to the north, you have the great boreal forests, and which are cold forests. They expect to be cold. They thrive in being cold and are really adapted to the kinds of climate that they have evolved in. To the west, you have, of course, the plains. In the south, then much more temperate forests and mixed deciduous forests. And so you see this border between these biomes kind of cutting right through the Great Lakes states. And as you can imagine, biomes are as much about the climate as they are about the species that have evolved within that climate and live there. And so as the climate changes, there will be pressure, essentially pressure upon the ecosystems where they are now to change in some way with the climate. And if you think about, again, where we are and where these borders are along, in some cases, what's called a tension zone between these different biomes, you can expect lots of changes, which is one of the reasons why folks are taking climate change in the Northwoods so seriously. So a question is, how do you take this essentially fire hose of information about climate change, about the effects of climate change on ecosystems of all sorts, and how do you bring it back to the folks that I talked about before who live and work in these ecosystems? And that is really about the applied science that we work with. And one way that we go about doing this is what we call the climate change response framework. So this framework is a structured, process-oriented approach to dealing with climate change. It's at its core partnership-based because, again, it really comes back to the people who live in these lands. They understand the places that they work in oftentimes better than a climate scientist or a forest ecologist who doesn't live and work there, who doesn't have sometimes generations of experience working there. So when we go to a place to work in that place, we work with the people who live and research and work in that place. And then of course there's vulnerability assessment. If we're talking about adaptation, we need to have an idea of what we're going to adapt. We need to have an idea of what's vulnerable. Otherwise, we're just kind of making stuff up, and it might not be to our benefit or to the forest benefit. So we engage in vulnerability assessment, and we do that with our partners, again, who work in that place and understand that place and have an idea of the information that they need. And then we develop forest adaptation resources, again, with partners to try to understand and find the best ways to apply information in ways that are practical and work for folks who work on the land. And then finally, because people learn oftentimes best from stories, we try to bring all this through to actually doing something on the ground. This isn't just about publication. This is about actually getting something done and then telling the story about the people who did it, about why they did what they did, and about how it's working out for them. Because people learn best, we think, from the experiences of other people, and then they learn best ultimately by doing. So, climate change response framework, where is it? This slide might look a little bit different, like a fancy sort of postcard-like handout. You'll notice that in fact you have a fancy postcard-like handout in front of you. That's this. So we work across the Midwest and the Northeast. We put borders around some of these projects. They're based partly on eco-regions. They're based partly on state borders. They're based partly on culture, because again, it comes down to who can do what, where, but also what are the ecosystems in given places and what are natural dividing lines if you have, say, a limited amount of time, resources, and money to do a vulnerability assessment. And I want to mention the USDA regional climate hubs for adaptation and mitigation. There's one in the Midwest led by Jerry Hatfield of ARS. There's one in the Northeast led by Dave Hollinger of the Forest Service. And then there's us, the Northern Forest Sub-Hub, and we span these hubs. Now, what are the purposes of these hubs? Well, they're to bring practical information to farmers, to ranchers, to foresters, to people working with the land, bring them practical information that they can use to help them make climate-informed decisions. And so again, because forests are so important across these two regions, we were asked to lead this Northern Forest Sub-Hub, which is what we're doing, and its goals are effectively all the goals that I just described to you a moment ago. So I'm going to come back to those 4 boxes again and address each of them briefly at least. Again, coming back to partners, who do we work with? Well, we work with everybody who will work with us. It's not just about working on federal lands or public lands or private lands. One critical idea here is that if you think about that map that I showed with all the different kinds of ownerships, there are a gazillion different views of how to work and live in the landscape and what people get out of it. And so if we're going to be effective in helping people deal with this issue of climate change and the pressure it places on forests, we need to work with everybody. We need to work with them on their terms. And I'll tell you right now that I'm convinced that diversity of approach to adaptation is just as important as biodiversity. So human diversity is critical, and creativity is critical to solutions to this problem. So to the vulnerability assessment, we do these vulnerability assessments. We look into the past and summarize past changes. We use always a range. You've heard about some of these ideas, a range of future climates, and we describe impacts on forests using models that also incorporate a range of plausible futures. So we never give people a future and say, this is it, deal with it. We always give them a range of plausible futures, a range of impacts, and say, yeah, now you got this range, deal with that. So that's actually not really usually what they want to hear. So we also bring in, again, our partners, and we look at the vulnerability of ecosystems across this range of plausible futures. Now, what I was just reminded not to forget to tell you is that we just released a vulnerability assessment. The Wisconsin and Western Upper Peninsula of Michigan vulnerability assessment, and there's a press release for this coming out tomorrow, but we have a printed copy of that press release for all of you today. So, and there is a copy floating around. I think Elizabeth has it, so you can ask her to see it. She grabbed it from me off the table. So, there's that. Now, what are some of these vulnerability assessments finding? Well, you heard some of this already. They're finding shorter, warmer winters, for one thing, all across the Great Lakes states. And this doesn't just have an effect on ecology, which it does, or wildlife. You heard about the moose example. It certainly has an effect on wildlife. It has an effect on people as well. If you're a logger, a lot of the time you're going to be doing your work in the winter on snowpack or on frozen ground. Now, with greater variability, which we've had, and less snowpack, which we've had, less frozen ground, which we've had, it affects your bottom line. It affects your operations. And if you go ahead and you do your harvest in conditions that aren't ideal, you might damage the soil and be asked to come back and fix that. Again, it costs money, and it affects these people. So it's not always just about ecology. It's about the people who work in these forests and the way that they work with them. Another thing is drier growing seasons. And so you heard a lot about the variability rather. You heard about also more precipitation. And in fact, we have been getting more precipitation across the Northwoods. But it's not just how much precipitation you get in a year. It's how much precipitation you get in a growing season that matters to most of these tree species into these forests. But then is not just the amount of precipitation you get during the growing season, it's how you get it. And so if it comes in these torrential downpours, and we've seen a 2 to 3 time increase in many places in these downpours, you may get longer periods of dryness between them. And so what the tree is experiencing isn't the monthly average, it's experiencing the daily moisture availability in the soil, and it's experiencing the dryness of the air, and that's what's driving its transpiration. So if you're getting big downpours and a lot of that water is going right off into a stream, that's not helping the tree tremendously. In fact, it may just be causing some erosion. And additionally, as temperatures increase, you have greater potential for more evaporation from the soil and more transpiration from the trees. So again, this places potentially more stress on the trees. So when we talk about drier growing seasons, we're not necessarily referring to the precipitation, we're referring to what the tree or the forest experiences. And then you have just a whole slew of exacerbated stressors. So a lot of what climate change brings to the equation isn't necessarily something new. It's something we've already been dealing with in some form, and it just adds a new twist to it. Usually not a twist that you're appreciating. So you have warmer winter temperatures. Ideally, one thing that we get in a cold winter is fewer pest outbreaks, and pest outbreaks that aren't as bad in the following growing season, because those cold temperatures, especially if they last long enough, knock back the pests. Now that we've got warmer temperatures, we're getting not just worse outbreaks, but expanded ranges of many pests. And then you got something like exotic earthworms. Well, now that's not related to climate change. That's just something that's happening anyway. It's probably related to fishing. But since the last ice age, we haven't really had earthworms in the Northwoods, and now we're getting them, and they're changing the system. They're changing the soils. One of the things that they're doing is they are reducing the water holding capacity of many of the soils that they're inhabiting, and that's changing the understory and potentially the overstory of those forests over time. Now then you throw in hotter temperatures and potentially some drier periods between rainfall events, and essentially then climate change is exacerbating an effect, a process that ultimately didn't have anything to do with. And then, of course, invasive plants, just like in the waters that you just heard about from Kate, invasives are just generally a bad thing, and they seem to thrive on disturbance. And whenever anybody sticks them into a little tent and pumps them full of CO2, they love all this extra CO2. So what they do is, again, they make all of our forest management harder, and they're generally not species that we get anything out of or appreciate. So another exacerbated stressor. And they compete, of course, with the species that we do appreciate. So many, many more climate effects that we go through, and that list is a whole hour talk where I'm still striving to keep it down to only an hour. I won't do that to you, I promise. But what I will say is, like, look at those first 4 or 5. Now, if you get those in the right combination, especially that CO2 fertilization, which is just fundamentally a good thing, and there's evidence that without past CO2 fertilization, the world would be warmer right now, in fact, than it is. With all the right combinations, you could get a thriving, wonderful, healthy forest ecosystem. So it's not all bad all the time. But when you don't get the right combination, you can certainly get stress. And when you look at the bottom half of that list, a lot of that list is, again, about the pressure that the changing climate is going to place on these ecosystems. And in some times, it is going to be an outright reset with big events like catastrophic fire, or other extreme weather. So now, if you want a lot more information, go to forestadaptation.org, look up our assessments. You'll get tons of information there, and they're wonderful, practically beach reading. Okay, so forest adaptation resources. How do you deal with this? Again, one issue that we dealt with right away is that it's diverse ownership across the land, and we're not telling anybody what to do. And the harder you try to tell somebody what to do, the less you're going to get listened to. That's a given. So all of our work is designed to be approachable by all kinds of different people. And I'm sorry, I'm getting the 5-minute warnings here. Oh, I'll tell you, I thought I had at least 15 more. All right. So this is basically a structured approach to dealing with that information that I talked about. And then this slide, again, I could spend forever on this slide, but it's really wonky and it would certainly put you to sleep. But let's just say more about the structured approach, including moving from option and concept to action, and it's wonderful. If you're in the Forest Service, you absolutely love this kind of stuff. Okay, so how does it play out on the ground? Well, all of these little dots across all these different kinds of ownerships, these are places where we're actually working with people on their land where they've been through this structured process and come out of it with adaptation actions in mind. And each one of these is a story unto itself. They all have different reasons for doing what they do on the land and different ways of looking at the land, but they're all thinking about adaptation and usually thinking about it a little bit differently. A couple of examples. Menominee tribal enterprises. Part of the Menominee Nation, of course, they are a business. Now they inherently want to foster diversity as part of their land ethic, but they also produce saw timber because they're funding the tribe, or partly funding the tribe, of course. But the tribe also expects them to support cultural use of the forest, and so they have that added bit to their repertoire. So now they've been dealing with these oak wilt pockets that kills a bunch of the oak in their forest, and they got to go in and clear out the oak and then a buffer around the oak. It's kind of like a moonscape when they're done, and that's just the way you got to deal with it, otherwise it keeps killing everything. They got hundreds of these pockets, and now they're looking into the future and they're saying, well, what should we grow back? If we look 7 generations into the future, what's going to do well across the range of plausible futures? And what they're bringing back in isn't necessarily just what was there. It's what's there that they think will meet their timber goals, what will meet their cultural goals, and what will meet their diversity goals. What the big species will interact with the understory and the herbaceous layer. They're thinking about this in a very complex manner, but they're thinking ahead and they're not expecting what's there in the future to look like what's there now. Very interesting, complex story. This is a great example of a transitional approach to thinking about climate change. They're adapting the system to this range of plausible futures. Here's another example, the Ottawa National Forest. So they have a part of their forest plan says they should have 12,000 acres of young aspen. And this is mainly to support wildlife, ruffed grouse, warbler, deer for hunting, and also, of course, in doing this, it supports local communities. So as they look into the future, one of the things that they're thinking about is that this aspen is going to become harder and harder to get to reproduce on the landscape. It's one of those loser species, unfortunately. And so they want to try to keep it on the landscape as much as possible. So now they're not thinking about all kinds of transition right here. What they're thinking about is how do they meet their plan goals the way that their plan goals are now. And so one of the ways that they're doing this is they are reprioritizing aspen. And they're going into mature stands of aspen that are already beginning to transition into something else and that are often on marginal lands. And they're going to begin converting these into these younger stands so that as it becomes more and more difficult to get aspen to reproduce, they're going to have, across their landscape, they're going to have a nice suite of healthy younger stands that are better able to withstand the pressures of the changing climate, especially as it begins to change more rapidly and dramatically. So this is a great example of a resilience strategy. It's not that they're doing anything terribly different, but they're reprioritizing their list of things that they're supposed to do so that they're better prepared for the changes that they see coming. So lots more of these stories online, forestadaptation.org. Go to the demos and feel free to, they're written to be read quickly and then contact people and ask them what they're up to. All right, final thoughts. First of all, you heard a lot about variability today, but you also heard about direction, trends, big trends that we're in. We know enough, even given inherent uncertainty, we know enough to begin taking action now. And in fact, a big part of our work with people is how to take action and make responsible decisions and consider risk in light of the uncertainty. And when you think about the risk and you think about the decisions, those decisions are generally about people's perception of risk, about their needs of the land, and about the land itself. Big trends over space, but in a plot of land, it could be that climate is not the driving factor. It could be 100 years of past management. It could be a storm last winter. It could be something else that's really the big deal. And then there's the person who owns that land and works with it, and how they view it and what their own sense of risk is and what their own needs are. That's going to drive their management decisions. And so when we work with people, we keep that first and foremost in our minds. And frankly, it helps us to listen better and helps us to help them meet their needs more effectively.